charge against the prisoner is murder, and the punishment of murder is death. And that simple statement is sufficient to suggest to you the awful nature of the occasion which brings you and me face to face. Those words, spoken by Lord Inglis at the opening of his address to the jury at the trial of Madeleine Smith in 1857, were repeated to similar dramatic effect by John Comrie Thompson at the trial of Alfred John Monson 35 years later. Perhaps the reason murder trials were such thrillingly dramatic events, followed by the entire nation in those days, was because they were so intense, and because the life of the prisoner depended so utterly upon their outcome. A guilty verdict, as all involved in the trial, and those without knew very well, meant that the prisoner who stood in the dock before them would be hanged in 4 or 5 weeks' time. There was no real mechanism of appeal before 1907, and this focused the minds of all quite wonderfully. Judges, public prosecutors, and presumably juries could not sleep at night for the terrible responsibility which rested with them. It is against this background the trial of Alfred Monson must be considered. It is notable, too, for the appearance of Dr. Joseph Bell, the man upon whom Arthur Conan Doyle based the character of Sherlock Holmes. And the murder of Cecil Hambrough at Ardlamont one August morning in the summer of 1893 was a mystery worthy of Sherlock Holmes.
It was a moonless night, but not dark, and Cecil Hambrough and his friend Alfred Monson had gone out fishing in a small rowing boat in Ardlamont Bay in West Scotland. The boat unaccountably sank offshore. Hambrough was not able to swim, which made his situation that August evening in 1893 perilous. But fortunately he had managed to get to shore, and both men, now soaking wet, together with a third man called Scott, who had remained on the shore, rescued the boat and gear, and then returned to Ardlamont House, where they had a whisky in the smoking room. Although thwarted in their fishing expedition, the 3 men decided to go out hunting the following morning. They were up at 5:30 for this purpose. Mrs. Monson, Alfred's wife, left the house with their 3 elder children to visit Glasgow at around 6 a.m., and the 3 men went out shooting at around 7 a.m. Alfred Monson and Cecil Hambrough took shotguns with them, while Scott, the third man, who did not shoot, went along to bag their catch in place of the usual gamekeeper. As the morning mist cleared, the 3 men were seen by a holiday-maker named Dunn, striding out from the house, with Mr. Scott in the middle, and the 2 sporting men either side of him. The countryside echoed for a time with the sound of gunshots. A little time afterwards the guns fell silent, and Mr. Scott and Alfred Monson were seen walking back towards Ardlamont House, where they informed the butler that Cecil Hambrough had accidentally shot himself. The butler and other servants of the estate hurried to the scene and found Cecil Hambrough dead near a dyke, with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. He was carried back to the house, and here they washed his wound and sent for Dr. Macmillan. The doctor arrived at noon, and upon being told by Monson and Scott that they had become separated from Hambrough, and had found Cecil dead at the dyke, he decided it was a tragic accident, and signed the death certificate accordingly. The Procurator Fiscal, John Campbell McCulloch, arrived in the afternoon, and examined the scene. Monson said he had heard a shot, and called out to Hambrough to inquire what he had got. Receiving no reply, he and Scott had gone to the place and found him dead. They also told him incidentally that Hambrough had not completed an insurance policy on his life, which meant that he and his wife had lost out financially by his death. It seemed apparent to McCulloch, too, that Hambrough's death was an accident. That same day, the third man, Edward Scott, who was apparently an engineer who had come to Ardlamont just 2 days before at Hambrough's request to examine a steam yacht he was purchasing, left the house. Alfred Monson sent a telegram informing Cecil's parents of the accident, and they travelled up to Argyllshire, and arrangements were made for Cecil's body to be interred in a family grave on the Isle of Wight. Windsor Cecil Hambrough was born in 1873, the son of Major Dudley Hambrough and Marion Ellers. The family was wealthy, but Major Hambrough was a spendthrift, had been broke for many years, and although there was considerable wealth in the family property, he could not access any of this personally. This was because the family estates had been entailed, making him effectively a tenant for life, able to live on the income of the estates, but not the capital. His eldest son, Cecil, displayed neither prudence nor academic aptitude, and when he was 17, his father decided to appoint a tutor for him, with a view to his getting a commission in the army. An acquaintance of his, a Mr. Beresford Tottenham, introduced him to a 30-year-old tutor who was duly appointed to instil in Cecil the necessary education required for an army commission. The tutor was Alfred John Monson. Although well-connected and to outward appearances wealthy, Alfred Monson was actually without any meaningful income at all. In fact, by 1892 he was broke. He was born in Ripley, Yorkshire in 1860 to the Reverend John Monson and Caroline Isabella Monckton Arundel, a daughter of the Earl of Galway. He claimed he had attended Oxford University, although there is no record of this, and in 1881 he married Agnes Maud Day, finding employment as a tutor to wealthy young men. But he aspired to greater things. He dabbled in many financial ventures as a means of elevating his fortunes, only succeeding in ruining himself. And by 1892 he was bankrupt, living on handouts from his friend Mr. Tottenham, on credit he could never hope to repay, and by pawning the family's valuables. He and Cecil's father, Major Hambrough, fell out, and the latter demanded his son's return home. But Monson was keen to hold on to his pupil, because he had not been paid by the father, and moreover, he knew the son would inherit £200,000 in a few months' time, when he reached the age of 21. That's about £26 million in 2020 terms. Cecil Hambrough was more than a friend. He was a financial asset. In spite of the state of his own finances, in April 1893, Monson, along with Cecil Hambrough, rented Ardlamont House in West Scotland, a Georgian mansion set in 600 acres. Here Cecil hunted and fished to his heart's content during the summer months, until the shooting accident on the 10th of August, which ended his life. The funeral of Cecil Hambrough was held at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight on the 17th of August, 1893, and the matter seemed to be closed. But on the 23rd of August, just 13 days after the terrible accident at Ardlamont House, 2 officials from the Mutual Life Insurance Company arrived at the Inverary office of the Procurator Fiscal. They had received a request for the payment of an insurance policy in respect of the life of Cecil Hambrough, and they required details from the Procurator Fiscal. It seems that Cecil Hambrough's life had, in spite of Monson's earlier declaration to the contrary, been insured just 6 days prior to his death for the sum of £20,000. That's more than £2.5 million in 2020 terms. And the beneficiary was Alfred Monson's wife, Agnes. The Procurator Fiscal, McCulloch, was stunned, and he decided to look again at the shooting accident. He asked Monson to submit the gun Hambrough had been using when he was shot, and Monson said he would dispatch both guns to him in the morning. But the guns did not arrive, so the Procurator Fiscal travelled to Ardlamont and asked the gamekeeper, Lamont, to fetch the guns for him. Curiously, when Lamont returned with the guns, he informed McCulloch that Hambrough had been using Monson's gun, and vice versa on the day in question. Thus Hambrough had been shot not with his own shotgun, but with Monson's gun. From questioning workers at Ardlamont, he learnt of the boating accident which occurred the day before the shooting. Although Hambrough had hired a boat for the summer, it seems that the man, Scott, and Monson had brought a second boat round from the ferry on the afternoon of the boating accident, and a makeshift hole had been gouged in the hull of one. Efforts by the police to find the man called Scott drew a blank. He seemed to have disappeared. Monson said he didn't know the whereabouts of Scott. He believed he was from Greenock. He even placed adverts in papers appealing for Scott to come forward, but Scott proved elusive. A nationwide manhunt began, and it was soon discovered that far from his being a marine engineer summoned from Greenock by Cecil Hambrough, he was in fact a London bookie calling himself Edward Davis, whose real name was Edward Sweeney. He was also known to be an associate of Alfred Monson's. The true state of Monson's financial woes were uncovered, and it was clear that the insurance on Hambrough gave him a powerful motive for murder. Reports that Monson and Scott had been seen strolling back to the house after the shooting without any sense of urgency convinced police that Hambrough's death was not accidental. On the 30th of August 1893, Alfred John Monson was arrested on suspicion of murdering Cecil Hambrough. Monson's story was that Hambrough himself had cut the hole in the boat with his knife. He said the boat had hit a rock 200 or 300 yards offshore, and Hambrough had clung to the rock while he had swum to the shore, returning with Scott in another boat to rescue his friend. He said the reason he had obtained another boat on the 9th of August was because he thought the usual boat used was unsafe. Concerning the shooting, he said Hambrough and he had used each other's guns that day, that he had heard a shot and called out to Hambrough to ask what he had got, but receiving no reply, he and Scott had gone to investigate and found Hambrough lying in a ditch dead, from which they had carried him to higher ground. It was a self-inflicted accident, he said. But on being told that the man Scott, whom he had been advertising for, was in fact a man called Davis or Sweeney, who was a known associate of his, Monson refused to answer further questions. The body of Cecil Hambrough was exhumed on the 4th of September. A post-mortem was conducted by Dr. Henry Littlejohn of Edinburgh University that same day. As a result, it was decided that Hambrough had been shot from behind by Monson's 12-bore shotgun and had died from shock and blood loss. The trial of Alfred John Monson began on Tuesday the 12th of December 1893 at Edinburgh Court of Justiciary before Lord Justice-Clerk Macdonald. The Solicitor General Alexander Asher prosecuted for the Crown, and John Comrie Thompson appeared for the defence. Scott or Davis Sweeney had not been located, so Monson stood in the dock alone. The charge against him was that he had attempted to murder Cecil Hambrough on the evening of the 9th of August, or in the early hours of the 10th of August, by cutting a hole in the hull of the rowing boat, knowing Hambrough could not swim, and that this attempt having failed, on the morning of the 10th of August, he and his accomplice, Scott, had murdered him by shooting him. The Crown called 72 witnesses, including expert firearms, medical and other witnesses, to prove its case. A succession of accountancy clerks, agents and solicitors appeared in court to show the complex series of financial arrangements that linked Alfred Monson to the victim Hambrough and his father, Major Dudley Hambrough. Although Major Hambrough was quite broke, living hand to mouth, his estates, which he held in entailment, were considerable, and both Tottenham and Monson had been involved in trying to squeeze more out of them. A great deal of court evidence was devoted to establishing the nature of these arrangements. Monson had tried and failed to extend the value of Major Hambrough's life insurance, and the two had fallen out because Hambrough distrusted Monson's motives. Monson, claimed the prosecution, sought to advance his own designs on the Hambrough estates. In 1894, the 20-year-old boy would come to the age of majority, 21, and his interest in the entailed estates would fall to him. Moreover, Monson appeared to exert a strangely mesmeric influence over Cecil Hambrough. The Crown attempted to show that Monson had tried to raise life insurance on Cecil Hambrough, which would pay out to Mrs. Monson. As a bankrupt, he could not benefit himself. He had made attempts with various insurance companies to insure Cecil Hambrough's life, claiming he had incurred substantial liabilities in respect of the Hambrough estates to a value of £50,000. But the companies naturally wanted details of these liabilities, and Monson could provide none. Then in July 1893, just weeks before the accident, he had changed tack. He sought insurance on Hambrough's life by another route. He applied for 2 policies of £10,000 each with the Mutual Insurance Company of New York. The reason given for these was that Cecil wished to purchase Ardlamont House, and Mrs. Monson was going to lend him the deposit for this of £20,000 until his 21st birthday, when he would repay her on coming into his inheritance. She simply wished to cover this liability until she was repaid, in case Cecil Hambrough died. Confirmatory letters from Mrs. Monson were now sufficient for the Mutual Insurance Company to issue the policies on Cecil Hambrough's life. These policies were issued and the first premium paid to activate them on the 8th of August 1893, the day before the alleged attempt on Hambrough's life. The prosecution also produced witnesses to show that Monson had secured a second boat along with the man named Scott on the afternoon of the 9th of August, that he had pretended not to know Scott, although evidence showed that Scott was a London bookie called Sweeney, whom Monson was well acquainted with. Witnesses attested that there were no rocks 200 or 300 yards from shore, which Monson had claimed the boat had struck. It was shown that a hole had been made in the 4th plank from the keel with a knife, which had caused the boat to sink, and that when his plan failed, the following morning the 3 men had gone out shooting at 7 a.m., and Hambrough was murdered. They sought to show that the body had fallen where it was found, not in a ditch as Monson claimed, because there were no signs of a body having lain in the ditch, or of any blood traces anywhere but the place in which it was found. The gun used was Monson's, not Hambrough's, they said, and they had both been using their own guns, which was confirmed by the fact that the cartridges found in Hambrough's pocket were for his 20-bore gun, not for that which had killed him. James MacNaughten, an Edinburgh gunsmith, told the court he had fired shots into a cadaver at Edinburgh mortuary to ascertain the effect of gunshots on it. Dr. Henry Littlejohn, police surgeon and professor of medical jurisprudence at Edinburgh, who had carried out the post-mortem, said it was impossible for the injuries to have been self-inflicted. Dr. Macdonald Brown, surgeon anatomist, who had examined the skull of the victim, concluded that the shot which killed him had been fired from behind and at a horizontal point of entry. Dr. Patrick Henry Watson declared, "The wound was fired by the hand of another. It could not have been fired by Mr. Hambrough himself, either designedly or accidentally." Dr. Joseph Bell, whose personality and predilections for reason and the detection of crime had inspired Arthur Conan Doyle in his creation of Sherlock Holmes, also told the court that the wound could not have been self-inflicted, and that the shot had been fired from a distance of between 6 feet and 9 feet. Pellet scars found in the trees at head height, in line with the shot which killed Hambrough, showed the position from which the shot was fired, according to the prosecution. The gardener of the house, Archibald White, testified he had seen tracks in the grass that morning, which appeared to show the 2 men tracking and closing on Hambrough. It was a good case, with strong circumstantial features, but the forensic evidence was its chief distinguishing feature. The expert witnesses, Doctors Joseph Bell, Littlejohn, Watson, and the gunsmith MacNaughten, placed considerable emphasis on the nature of the wound sustained, and on the direction and distance from which the shot had been fired. Dr. Joseph Bell, along with his colleague Dr. Littlejohn, sought to establish the incontrovertible scientific nature of their evidence. The prosecution felt confident that the forensics, together with the strong insurance motive, would secure the case. But the defence, led by John Comrie Thompson, met the Crown on its own terms. In particular, evidence was heard from Professor Hay of Aberdeen University, which in almost every respect contradicted that given by Doctors Bell, Littlejohn, and others. He stated that the shots in the 3 trees were at least 2 months old when examined, completely unrelated to the shot which killed Hambrough, that the experiments he had carried out himself on horses' heads, etc., showed that the shot had been fired from about 2 feet 8 inches to 2 feet 10 inches at the most, and possibly from as near as 2 or 3 inches away. He denied that the ditch would necessarily have any blood in it, or that there would be traces of blood on the ground if the body had been moved, saying that shattered bone fragments could have temporarily plugged the wound, and rain washed away other traces on the ground. The evidence given by Hay essentially cancelled out the expert testimony of the prosecution, to the fury of Dr. Bell and Dr. Littlejohn. It was rendered more damaging still by the fact that the Crown had not been given precognoscence of the evidence. That is, the content of their evidence was not pre-disclosed to the prosecution, to ensure that its experts could be consulted. The Solicitor General had been completely blindsided. As his case had been based heavily on forensics, it was a serious blow. Asher did his best to shake Hay's testimony in cross-examination, but the body of Hay's evidence remained intact, and it stood as a bulwark, therefore, against that of the prosecution. The prosecution's summing up of such a complex case was a substantial task for Asher. He had to simplify and clarify the matter for the 15-man jury. He did it very well, especially the part alluding to motive, which involved the most complex financial arrangements put before a court at that time. Comrie Thompson, for the defence, began his address to the jury to spine-tingling effect, referring to the case of Madeleine Smith in 1857, at which he had been present as a young man. He spoke of sitting in that same court 35 years earlier, at which Lord Advocate Inglis defended the life of Madeleine Smith, and he repeated the words spoken on that occasion. "Gentlemen," Lord Inglis had said, "the charge against the prisoner is murder, and the punishment of murder is death, and that simple statement is sufficient to suggest to you the awful nature of the occasion which brings you and me face to face." Thompson said the prosecution case was based largely on motive, and motive, even if proved, was not sufficient, he said. It should not be used to eke out imperfect evidence. As regards motive, Tottenham was maintaining Monson, an arrangement which was dependent on Hambrough's life. To remove him was counter to Monson's interests. Concerning the insurances being sought on Cecil Hambrough's life by Monson, it was, he said, a necessary condition of the purchase of the Eagle Company's interest in the Hambrough estates. That was its sole purpose. But the insurance policy was of no effect until Hambrough came of age in June 1894. Monson knew this. It was Tottenham, he said, who had pressed the insurance claim as a bluff, not Monson. He said that the man Scott, if indeed he was Davis or Sweeney, had come to examine the boat Monson was purchasing for Hambrough. It was quite natural that he should leave without examining the boat, because the sale of the boat would no longer go through. He was not required. Why, he asked, would Monson bring a third man, Scott, to witness him murder his friend? Concerning the boat accident on the evening of the 9th of August, there was no evidence that it was anything other than an accident. And regarding the death of Hambrough, it was known that Monson had got Hambrough's gun from Lamont that morning, There was no evidence he had given it to him. It was indeed his own contention that he had found Scott and Hambrough had already gone out, so he was obliged to use Hambrough's gun himself. There was nothing to disprove this. Nor did the cartridges found in Hambrough's jacket pocket relating to the 20-bore gun show it was a 20-bore gun Hambrough was using that day, as it was 2 weeks later when the jacket was examined and the cartridges found, and many people had had access to it. It was quite clear that the prosecution's claim that the shot had been fired from 9 feet distance was wrong. The shot had been fired from a distance of 2 to 3 feet at most, and possibly considerably closer. Hambrough was walking on the wall, the high ground, naturally giving him the hunter's vantage point, and he had tripped in one of the many holes in the rough and slippery ground. The trails seen by White, tracking eastwards apparently in pursuit of Hambrough, were actually old trails and had no bearing upon the incident. In conclusion, all the evidence pointed to this being a tragic accident. There was no proof that it was otherwise. What a terrible regret it would be for them, he warned the jury, if they sent a man to his death and it was subsequently discovered by some means that he was quite innocent. Lord Justice-Clerk Macdonald's charge to the jury was exhaustive and detailed. Macdonald examined every substantive piece of Crown evidence and dismantled it. He referred to evidence unseen, to letters unheard in court, and proposed his own theories to explain away instances detrimental to the prisoner. The jury retired at 4 p.m. and was out for 73 minutes. When it returned, the foreman gave its verdict as one of not proven on both charges. Alfred Monson was freed. There were 4 reasons why the prosecution failed. The first reason was the complexity of the case, particularly that of the financial evidence relating to motive. The Solicitor General did his best to simplify this, but it was difficult to coalesce all of these strands into a single thread which pointed quite definitely in Monson's direction. Secondly, the heavy reliance on the forensics was probably a mistake. The assertion that the gun had been 9 feet away when fired seemed doubtful. The testimony of Dr. Hay suggested it was 3 feet, possibly even inches away. The net effect of this gulf between the opinions of the experts was that for all their certainty and ability to conduct experiments on horses' heads, cardboard models, and even cadavers, they might be wrong. One side certainly was, perhaps even both. The third reason for the failure of the prosecution case was the absence of the alleged accomplice. It was by no means certain that Scott was the man Davis or Sweeney. Was he a marine engineer, as the defence counsel suggested, who had come to inspect the engines at Hambrough's request, and had left after his death simply because he was not required? Or was he a co-conspirator? In his absence it was all merely speculation. The fourth reason was the judge's charge to the jury. It was extraordinary. MacDonald took the defence line in nearly every point raised. The extensive lies and deceit of Monson should be given little, if any, weight by the jury, he told them. He dismissed the insurance claim as a motive. He declared the prosecution evidence concerning the rock which Monson claimed the boat had struck to be inadequate. He accepted Monson's claim that he had swum 200 or 300 yards, or thought he had. He accepted the defence claim that if the 2 men knew Hambrough was dead, there would be no need for them to hurry back. And he took the defence line concerning Scott, declaring that there was no advantage to the prisoner in his being present. He went further, suggesting that Scott may have come to Scotland to visit relatives, a claim not even made by the defence. Evidence of Doctors Hay and Saunders, the defence experts, he said, confirmed the theory of the body having been lifted from the place where it was, completely overturning evidence to the contrary. And then, with no sense of irony at all, he said, "All I have said to you, however, is just suggested for your consideration." The points so decisively rejected by the judge, and of such importance in the case, should have properly gone to the jury without the judge's predetermination of them. The choice they faced was a stark one: to accept the evidence that was so suggestive of Monson's guilt, in defiance of the judge's clear direction against this, or to free him. As in the case of Madeleine Smith 35 years earlier, they quite understandably flinched from the consequences such a verdict would bring. They delivered a verdict of not proven. This verdict, peculiar to Scottish law, did not exonerate Monson, and it was not intended to. Only a not guilty verdict, an absolute acquittal, would render him innocent. The stain on his character should remain in the jury's estimation. They believed him to be guilty, but that the Crown evidence had not proved it to their complete satisfaction. The evidence of the prosecution had been too dependent on forensic deductions, and although intended to strengthen the case, its effect proved fatal to it. Sherlock Holmes was wrong. But from the safety of a historical perspective, it is, in my view, beyond a reasonable doubt that Monson was responsible for the murder of Cecil Hambrough, and that the man, Scott Davis Sweeney, was his accomplice in this. The chief reasons for this are, first, the motive, in spite of the efforts of Thompson to characterize the insurance on Hambrough's life as a design on the Hambrough estates. It had changed its purpose by the summer of 1893. It was no longer the means to securing the estate. It had become an end in itself. When such hopes of gaining insurance by this means failed, he came up with an ingenious plan: to pretend to the insurance company that Hambrough sought to purchase the Ardlamont estate and needed to underpin a personal loan from Mrs. Monson by insuring his life against accident. It worked, and the payment of the premium was obtained from Tottenham, £250, which Monson claimed, quite absurdly, was the deposit on the purchase of Ardlamont. Here was the plain, unvarnished motive. It had reduced unequivocally to a simple insurance claim on the life of Cecil Hambrough. Second, Scott had no purpose for being at the estate, pretending to be a stranger to Monson, an engineer to inspect the boilers of a yacht Monson was buying on Hambrough's behalf. Scott made no attempt to examine the yacht during his 3-day presence there. His sole actions were rowing a second boat round from the ferry with Monson, bathing with him in the sea, being present when the boat capsized, and acting as gamekeeper on the morning of the death. His purpose was malign. Why did they want a second boat? Because it would be necessary to rescue Monson from deep water on a dark night, fully dressed. Third, the gun which killed Hambrough was Monson's. Doubtless it was fetched from Lamont by Monson, because Lamont confirmed this. But it was Monson's word alone, espoused only 2 weeks later when the Procurator Fiscal had become involved, that he did not, as would be expected at all other times, deliver the weapon into its rightful hands, and then fetch his own 12-bore gun, the gun which killed Cecil Hambrough. The cartridges found in Hambrough's pocket were indeed for a 20-bore shotgun, and if this was not conclusive, then it was surely highly suggestive. Every circumstance, and almost all the material evidence, points to this conclusion. That a shooting accident can occur in the most improbable manner, the back of the head, is a rare thing. But rare things happen in the most improbable ways, as the judge was keen to point out. But the odds against such an accident occurring are long. And when such an accident occurs, along with another unusual event, that the same man nearly drowned the previous evening, it becomes more difficult to dismiss such an accident simply to the long odds of nature. When the victim had been insured for a very large sum just 6 days earlier, and effect to this insurance was given just 1 day before the first accident, and further, the person in his company on both occasions was the beneficiary of this insurance, the odds become very long indeed. And when the alleged killer has brought a man down just 1 day prior to that accident, under false pretenses, under a false name, feigning to be a boat engineer, and claiming not to know him, and all the accused man's attempts to secure a share of the victim's estates have failed in recent weeks, and he was bankrupt and pawning cutlery and other items, was running up debts and defaulting on loans, and the victim was shot not with his own gun but with the accused man's gun. When all of these improbable circumstances, each incurring its own inherent probability, capable of being displaced, are placed in conjunction, they produce astronomical odds against their concurrence. They become as improbable as the universe. But we do not require such a proof that is tested to the limits of the universe. We require only a conviction beyond a reasonable human doubt. And that conviction we surely have. We can never know, certainly, the exact events as they unfolded on those 2 days, on the 9th and 10th of August, 1893, because only 3 men witnessed them, one of whom was dead, and the other 2 were his killers. But I believe that it was something along the following lines. Monson was a man of greater ambition than wealth, and he lived like a lord. By early 1893 he was bankrupt, and only the occasional payment from Tottenham kept the family afloat, on the expectation they both had of accessing Cecil's inheritance when he reached the majority age of 21. That was some months away, and Monson took Ardlamont in April 1893. The rental cost was £450 per year, of which £225 was due on the 1st of August, only days before the death. The pressure on Monson was now enormous, and by mid-July the last vestiges of hope Monson had of purchasing the interest in the Hambrough estates had gone. It is this sense of urgency and the uncertainties over Hambrough's prospective fortune which persuades Monson to insure his friend's life for £20,000. The complex financial arrangements conducted over the years have now become one of a simple insurance matter. Cecil Hambrough's life is insured for £20,000. If he dies, that money will be paid to Mrs. Monson. This plan is not a newly hatched plan. It has begun, like all ideas, as a wish, a hope, and by July it has become a definite plan. The circumstances of his finances and the failure of all other prospects have made him all but destitute, a destitute living in a mansion. But that pretence is about to be cruelly exposed with the demand for rent due on the 1st of August. Rent he cannot hope to pay. And he doesn't have to. He has another means of taking care of all his financial woes. He is seen many times in the company of a bookie called Davis in the weeks before, a man of dubious character whose real name is Sweeney. What ideas were conjured by the two will never be known, but it is clear that the remote location of Ardlamont is the place designated for the murder, and a boating accident as the means of accomplishing it. The matter is urgent by August for 2 reasons. Finances are desperate. The silverware is gone, so is Mrs. Monson's jewellery. Creditors are thumping on their door, and a lot of people will come to stay at Ardlamont on the 12th. They will stay for the shooting season until the late autumn. Any opportunity of killing Hambrough will be lost for the rest of the year. But he is unable to act until the insurance policy is settled, so he presses this with the greatest urgency, and he finally collects this on the 8th of August. He sends a telegraph to his friend Davis Sweeney in anticipation of this, covertly calling him to Ardlamont to prosecute their plan. Davis packs immediately and takes the Flying Scotsman to Edinburgh, and from here makes for Ardlamont. On his arrival, Monson and he greet each other as strangers. This has clearly been agreed. During Scott's 3-day stay, there is no suggestion that Scott is a friend of Monson's, but that he is a marine engineer called Scott, who has come down to inspect the boilers of a yacht Monson is purchasing for Hambrough. Scott is nervous. Murder is a serious undertaking. The following day, Scott and Monson go to fetch a second boat and bring it round to Ardlamont Bay, ostensibly because they require another boat because the usual one used by Hambrough is unsafe. But its real purpose is that they require two boats, one for fishing and one for the rescue of Monson by his accomplice. He also wants to show Scott the lie of the land and to have a dry run at the plan. They row the boat round to Ardlamont Bay. As they enter the bay, they are seen by the governess, Edith Hiron, and by the nursemaid, who are on the shore with the children. Up above, strolling on the cliff-top, Mrs. Monson is seen walking with Cecil Hambrough. Monson walks up to the house alone, while Scott remains in the boat, for no reason anyone can discern. Scott is now engaged in sabotaging the boat by cutting a hole in it with his knife. There follows a quiet evening meal, at which the suggestion of some night fishing is made, by whom we do not know, and it hardly matters because Hambrough will certainly be enthusiastic to such a suggestion. It is arranged that Monson and Hambrough are to go out in the boat together, and that Scott will sit on the shore. This is really rather peculiar, but Monson planned to row out to deep water. It is imperative that he be rescued in the dark night by a third man in a boat. To swim 300 yards or more at midnight, fully dressed and in shoes, would be hazardous for the best of swimmers. At 10 p.m., the three men leave the house. We know the boat capsized at some point as a result of the hole in the boat taking in water. The story of the boat striking a rock 200 to 300 yards offshore is impossible. No such rocks exist. In fact, in the words of the Scottish national poet, the best laid plans of mice and men do not allow for all eventualities. Probably Scott cut the hole a little too large, presumably plugged it with something to be removed when the boat was out in deep water. But it must have become dislodged as the weight of the two men displaced the water and created pressure on the boat. In any case, the boat now began to take in water prematurely. In fact, they will have been moving from shore rather slowly, paying out the 150-yard net for the fishing as they rowed, when it became clear the boat was foundering. It sank within easy reach of shore, both men being thoroughly soaked, but it was sufficiently shallow for Cecil to walk ashore. One can easily imagine the grim looks exchanged between Scott and Monson under cover of the night as the three men gather on the foreshore and survey the boat. Hambrough ruining the ruin of the night's plans, and Scott and Monson ruining the ruin of theirs. The plan had gone wrong, completely wrong. When they left Ardlamont at 10 p.m., Scott and Monson fully expected to be returning to the house in the early hours, one man down. Monson soaked, possibly Scott also by this time, to report that Hambrough had been lost in the sea, and in spite of their valiant efforts, they had been unable to find him. In the morning his body would be found, and in due course the insurance would be claimed. It had seemed foolproof. But the three men returned to the house, Monson's mind now working furiously as they sit in the smoking room and drink whisky. It is 1 a.m. At some point amongst the exchanges of looks between Monson and his accomplice, an opportunity is found to talk. It had failed, but Monson has an urgent, inventive mind, and something of the persistence of a terrier in all his dealings. He is determined that Hambrough must die, and time is short. He decides that a shooting accident must be arranged. It must be done as soon as possible. And the following day his wife and children are absent. They go to Glasgow for haircuts and clothes to prepare for the 12th when visitors will arrive. The opportunity is too great to be denied. Perhaps Scott balks at this. He is a nervous man. They are now making plans on the hoof. There has been no rehearsal. It has not been thought through at all. It is in fact a serious mistake. But Monson is a man of considerable arrogance, as all his enterprises before and later show. How it is arranged that the two men should go shooting at 7 a.m. the following morning is unknown, But it was clearly done that night, because the night later turned out thunder and lightning. Rain fell heavily after 6, and the wind whipped in off the sea. It seems probable that Monson suggested it, possibly as a compensation for the ruined night's fishing. Hambrough is up at 5:30 a.m. to see Mrs. Monson for some reason, which is not elucidated in the trial. And at 7 a.m. the 3 men leave the house, Hambrough for the last time alive. 3 abreast they go. To the east is Hambrough, oblivious as he hunts that he is himself the prey, stalked by his killers. Glances are exchanged between the conspirators. Soon they are out of sight of the schoolhouse, and Dunn, the holiday-maker, is the last man to see them as the fatal moment approaches. There is a mizzle of rain. It is an inclement August day, no day for shooting, but they will get some rabbits in the woods, perhaps the odd wood-pigeon, thinks Hambrough. They move under cover of the woods. Monson looks anxiously about him, to ensure there is no unwanted witness to the events which are now closing fast upon them. No person illicit to his purpose, some poacher who may bag a bigger prize, but no, there is none. He follows Hambrough, watches his unsuspecting back, perhaps only yards ahead, through the wet grass and bracken, checks for Scott close by, following silent in his footsteps. Perhaps Hambrough knows he is there, is careless of his youth, to have a man with a loaded gun behind him. Perhaps his ears are plugged against the gunshots that rent the air, but he is apparently unaware, as he rakes the ground ahead for signs of prey, that the hunt is truly on. Unaware of the irony of his position, that he has only moments left to live. Perhaps he takes a rabbit or a wood-pigeon in his sights. There is a breathless focus divided in its purpose. He reaches a broken wall and dike, which affords him a good view, hears the bracken softly crack underfoot, and some undistinguishable sound behind. And then from far off the open rush of an explosion thumps his head, the briefest sensation of the trees and sky and ground beneath him collapse in woods to a heavy, enduring silence. The man behind him, his friend, trembling, adrenaline coursing through him, just 3 or 4 feet behind him, not 9, the hazard of such a miss could not be risked. He is close upon him, hears the sound of his gun singing in his ears like thunder, and he sees the body of his friend fold within, his life extinguished. They may have moved him, because they would certainly wish to be assured of his death. Scott looks at the fallen man. "Is he?" Monson cries hoarsely. Scott turns, shaken by this unanticipated violence, only nods, distrusting himself to words. They stand in silence a few moments to gather their thoughts and calm their nerves. Then, forcing themselves to resolution, they collect the gun and leave the murdered man. A final hurried glance to check behind nothing is left undone, and then slowly they walk back, without the urgency of accident to hurry them, but the steady claims of murder pressing upon them. Their even pace to the house is noted, and they pass the stables without a sign of what has passed. Only the strange silence and the absence of their colleague looks amiss. Upon entering the house, this same calmness prevails. They unload the guns, say nothing, and James Wright, the butler, comes to attend them. "Where is Mr. Hambrough?" he inquires. "He has shot himself. He is dead," is the reply. It seems unreal, to the butler and both men too. They do not lead him to the site or put in place any actions. Perhaps it is shock, certainly it must be, and yet there is a complicity in their actions, a guilt that speaks of their situation, of what has happened. The body is brought back to the house, and washed and dressed. The doctor and others are taken to the scene of Hambrough's death, and the narrative unfolds. On her return to Ardlamont in the evening, Mrs. Monson is distraught when she hears the news, and confines herself to her bedroom. But the plan was hasty. It was imperfect. There have been inevitably mistakes. All is well at first. The matter is an accident, and the doctor and procurator fiscal are persuaded that those long odds of nature which sometimes intrude too brutally upon our lives are to blame for the death of the boy in the woods. There is nothing to investigate, and there is no motive to suggest that there should be anything more than an official account of the tragedy given. There is no insurance on the boy's life even, and his friend and apparent benefactor, Monson, has only lost by the young man's death in friendship and fortune. But when Monson 2 weeks later meets the procurator fiscal, McCulloch, and tells him as he walks to the office that 2 insurance men are with him who wish to have a report from him that the death is purely accidental, he is naturally surprised. "Why, there is no insurance," he says sharply. Monson does not receive the quiet acquiescence he expected, and says, "Apparently his father took out insurance on him without the boy's knowledge." It is a dangerous lie, not one that should have been dismissed by the judge, but it is one Monson must venture if he is to realize his fortune. In time all is unpicked, and he is charged with murder, and though there are no doubts on the part of the authorities that Monson and the man Scott murdered Hambrough for his insurance money, the evidence does not satisfy the jury sufficient to find him guilty. They believe he did it, but that the evidence has not proved the matter. This may not be an exact account, but I believe it is something close. There is one final twist in this tale. In the summer of 1898, 5 years after the death of Cecil Hambrough, Monson entered a petition against his wife Agnes for divorce. The grounds for the divorce were that she had committed adultery with an unknown person on the 24th of July, 1891, and that in October and November she had committed adultery at the Hotel Metropole in Whitehall, London, with Cecil Hambrough. She did not contest the petition, but the specificity of the place, the Hotel Metropole, suggests Monson had proof. In addition, the presumption must be that such a terrible stain on a Victorian lady's character would only go unchallenged if there was such proof. This adds an intriguing dimension to the case, which is only obliquely caught in the undertow of the murder proceedings. We know the Sheriff of Argyllshire admitted failing to take possession of Mrs. Monson's documents, and in particular 2 letters referred to in court. We know, too, that Cecil Hambrough saw Mrs. Monson on the morning of his death for some purpose never disclosed in court, and we know also that Mrs. Monson was seen walking on the cliffs with Hambrough at around 3 p.m. on the day of the boat accident, and that they were in plain view of the husband and Scott bringing the boat into shore. What was the nature of this relationship? Was the fact that Mrs. Monson confined herself to her room, quite distraught on learning of Hambrough's death, something more than ordinary human grief at the tragic loss of a friend? It is difficult to judge at this distance. But Cecil Hambrough was a young man of 20, and young men of 20, even those passionate about shooting and fishing, have other needs that preoccupy them. Is it possible that Cecil and Agnes Monson were involved in an affair? If so, Monson must have been aware of this, and furthermore, it is quite possible that he used his wife as bait to keep the young Hambrough in his thrall, sufficient to resist his own father and mother's pleas, their urgent requests for him to return home. The mesmeric effect and absolute control Monson exerted over Hambrough was a major part of the prosecution case. But no adequate explanation as to how he could achieve such control was given. Mrs. Monson would certainly provide such an explanation for this. Monson was immoral enough to use his wife in such a way, and if he did so, it is also quite likely that even in his complicity in his wife's adultery, he would have resented it. And it would, in his own mind, have given him a just cause when he considered the murder of his friend for the insurance. This is, of course, in the nature of speculation, but there is one further persuasive incident which I believe gives credibility to this idea. When Monson met his wife on the evening of Hambrough's death, The manner of his telling her of the accident is unusual. He says that Hambrough has had an accident. She asks him, is it serious? He says he is dead. It is a particularly cruel way of breaking such news. He meets her, looks her in her eyes, and tells her Hambrough has had an accident. This lessens the incident, tees her up for what is to come. Her mind naturally scans the various possibilities. Perhaps he has cut himself badly, or fallen in some way. Is it serious? She inquires. One can almost sense the gloating anticipation behind the dramatic impact of his next words. He is dead. There is, of course, no easy way of delivering terrible news of this kind, but the time-honoured way of doing so is to say something along the lines of, I have some bad news, I'm afraid. Cecil has had a terrible accident. He's dead. In such a way one is led by a natural progression into the inescapable fact of what has happened. It would be usual as well, on such an occasion, to greet the recipient of such news with a face which foretells something of the gravity of the news that is about to be imparted. But Agnes Monson seems to have had no hint of it. He seems to have greeted her in a quite normal fashion, judging by her reaction, as though nothing was amiss. And this led her into the inquiry, is it serious? Monson has had his revenge on them both. And then there is that stubborn and startlingly candid image we hear of from the governess and the nursemaid in court, of the children playing on the beach, while on the cliffs Hambrough walks with Mrs. Monson. And upon this fixed scene of innocence and evil on a summer's day, when clouds are gathering in the sky, there is all the intrigue and deception that an operatic quartet expresses so well, but which is lost in a courtroom. A boat is in the bay with two men watching, who can hear the children's laughter murmuring across the waves, and they see the wife of one of them walking with a man whose murder they intend in hours. No one prospered from the death of Cecil Hambrough. The insurance money was not, of course, paid out. Monson was bankrupt still, exposed to all as a rogue and probably a murderer. Tottenham, the moneylender, was thoroughly discredited and decidedly out of pocket as a result of his dubious enterprises. He subsequently tried to sue Monson for the £250 fraudulently obtained, but the matter was protracted and Monson had no money. From frustration, he took the matter into his own hands in late 1895 and broke into Monson's house, removing the furniture and possessions, for which he received a 3-month prison sentence with hard labour. The third man, Scott, who disappeared, was indeed a bookie calling himself Davis, whose real name was Edward Sweeney. He broke cover in early 1894 and applied to the High Court to have his outlawry status revoked, which it duly was. Although it was claimed in court he was dying, in 1911, 18 years after the Ardlamont case, he was still working as a bookie and living at 111 Brixton Road in London with his brother and sister George and Ellen. Alfred Monson wrote an account of the Ardlamont mystery, attempting to exonerate himself from suspicion and to turn a profit, but it failed to convince anyone, and in fact sold few copies. He was paid by Madame Tussaud to sit for a wax figure of himself, and then, when they placed the figure alongside those of known murderers like Crippen, he sued. He won the case, and was awarded 1 farthing, a quarter of a penny, the smallest possible amount that could be paid, and he had to pay his own court costs. But the case did establish the principle in English law of libel by innuendo. His dishonest life caught up with him in 1898, to the delight of many. Along with 2 other men, he was charged with inveigling a young man into financial difficulties and then extorting money from his parents. He received a 5-year prison sentence with hard labour, which he served at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, just a few miles from the place where the man he murdered was buried. After his release from prison, he went to South Africa, where he was last heard of in 1920, at the age of 60. Cecil Hambrough's family had no doubts he had been murdered by Alfred Monson, and each year on the anniversary of his death they placed a cryptic notice in the newspapers. In memory of Cecil Dudley Hambrough, shot in a wood near Ardlamont on August the 10th, 1893, in his 21st year. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord.